Greetings, it's the Digital Dog, and today what I have for you is a tutorial on the histogram. Now I know what you're going to say, dog. If you go out on the internet, there are an awful lot of tutorials and videos on the histogram. Why another? Well, what I wanted to do was just bring my perspective to the topic and go into some details about histograms. So let's talk about what I'll cover, and then you can decide whether or not this is worth your time or not. So here's what we're going to cover in this video tutorial. First of all, for those who are new to the histogram, we'll start at the very beginning and talk about what a histogram is. We'll look at histograms in Adobe Photoshop, Adobe Camera Raw, and Lightroom. And once you get the idea of what histograms are all about, you should be able to take that information to other applications you may be using that provide a histogram. I'm going to talk about where I think histograms are useful in terms of showing us how our images may be clipping both color and tone. And of course, can't avoid color management. I will be talking about how histograms are useful for showing us whether or not the encoding color space that we're going to be using is large enough. So that's a very useful feature of histograms. Let me point out that reading some of these tutorials on the web and articles about histograms, it seems there's basically two general trains of thought in terms of histograms. Either a histogram is the greatest visual aid to working with images and evaluating them known to man and dog, or you should just kind of ignore them. They're too complicated and they don't provide anything useful. And I think by the time we get to the end of this tutorial, you'll see that the truth, more or less, lies somewhere in between. There are areas where histograms are not at all useful, and in fact, we'll talk about how histograms lie. And there are areas where histograms are very useful in determining various attributes about your images. I'm going to look at the histogram in Photoshop's Levels command. And the reason that's useful is you'll see exactly what a histogram provides and how altering your images using the Levels command illustrates what's really going on behind the scenes when you manipulate color and tone in terms of what the histogram then provides. I want to talk about how histograms don't necessarily tell us anything useful about our images. There are many examples where just looking at histogram and then an image shows us that the histogram by itself doesn't really tell us very much about image content. I want to go into some detail about how histograms lie and some of the misconceptions about histograms. They're useful, but like any other type of feedback, if you look at them and make an evaluation about images without looking at the images, if you look at just a histogram, you'll find that in many cases, the histograms are either lying to us or should be ignored. I'm going to talk about histograms and exposed to the right. This is a pretty controversial topic, and I think that once you see how histograms lie, you'll better understand how exposed to the right really operates and when it's useful. So are histograms useful? And if so, how? By the time we get to the end of this tutorial, hopefully that will all become fairly clear. So what is a histogram? Basically, it's a visual graph of tones, I like to call them levels, and optionally, the color content of our images. As you can see below is the histogram in Adobe Photoshop, and there's a lot of geeky information there that I'll go over rather quickly, but I don't want to gloss over what some of these particular features are. But what's important here is looking at the horizontal scale, which we see with this green line, which shows us our tonality from black over on the far left, which would be 0, or if we're talking about RGB, 0, 0, 0. And over on the far right, the whitest white in our particular image, which would be level 255. Now, one of the things that you should keep in mind is that no matter what type of image you're working with, whether it's a 8-bit per color or 16-bit per color image, whether it's RGB, CMYK, or lab, the histogram displays these levels in a scale ranging from 0 to 255. The vertical line in the histogram just represents the quantity of levels at that particular point. So you can see in this particular image, right around in the middle, there's a very large or tall area, and that simply tells us there's a lot of pixels at that level. And if you look over on the far right, there's an area where there's sort of a dip. There are very few pixels in that particular level. We're going to look in some detail at how the channels are going to affect what we see in the histogram. And in Photoshop, we have a lot of options. In other applications like Lightroom and Camera Raw, we don't necessarily have these options, and it can be argued whether or not this is necessary or not, but we'll go over them in some detail in Photoshop. And further, we can control whether or not the histogram is showing us the entire image, part of a selection, or part of a layer. And this can be very useful as well. Down below, what you're seeing is information about an individual level. You can see that there's a little crosshair I have over the image. And as you move that around the histogram, the information down below will update. You can see I have my histogram over a particular level, and it will give you an update down below. In addition, you can click and drag in Photoshop over a group of levels, and that's what you're seeing right here in this particular screen capture. So at this point, we're seeing a selection. This is actually levels 61 through 97 as outlined, and the information down below is showing us how many pixels total are being represented in that selection, and so forth. And I'll show you this in Photoshop in more detail. Another important feature in Photoshop that you need to keep in mind is the cache level. So basically, if every time you moved sliders or did something in Photoshop and the histogram had to update as accurately as possible, it would really slow things down. So as Photoshop is operating on an image, it builds up these cache levels, which is sort of a interpolated update of the actual histogram itself. When you're at level 1, you're up to date. In other words, you're seeing the most accurate preview of the histogram. As you keep moving sliders and altering the image, the cache level will raise to a certain point, and then you can simply click on the Update Cache button, which is outlined here. It's a little circle with 2 arrows. Or as you'll see in a second, there'll be a little warning on the histogram. You can click on that, and that will update the cache level to its most accurate representation of the data. So let's take a quick look at that in Photoshop. So here we are in Photoshop, and I've got a layered document. And essentially right now what I can do is see the histogram here. And as you can see, here's our little warning that we're at cache level number 4. If I click, it updates, and you can see the histogram changes just a little bit. As I move my cursor over the histogram, you can see, for example, that at this point, I'm at level 82 out of 256 levels, and it tells me some information about the standard deviation, the median, so on and so forth. It tells us the number of pixels, 1914803, in the image that represents that particular level. Now what I can do is I can control click here, and as I move the selection around, the histogram updates and shows me information based on what's underneath that particular layer. If I deselect and select my background image and change this to entire image, now I'll make a selection, and as I move it around, it shows me all of the information underneath this selection as far as the histogram is concerned. So it isn't necessarily looking at a specific layer. Again, if I deselect, come up here and pick, say, this particular layer, I have the option on source to now go from entire image to selected layer, and it shows me the histogram of just that layer. And once again, you can see if I want the most accurate preview of what that data represents, I can simply click here. Not a tremendous difference, as you can see. Back in our presentation, I wanted to point out again that we can click and drag an area on the histogram, and that can update the information that we see down below. So for example, if I go to entire image and update the cache, I can literally click and drag, and now what I'm seeing is the information down below in terms of the feedback numbers, levels 41 through 80. gives me the mean, standard deviation, and median of pixels. That's pretty geeky. We can go into that at another time. It tells me the number of pixels that are being selected in terms of the histogram. So to get into more detail about the feedback for the Photoshop histogram, we're able to view individual color channels, a composite of all the color channels, or what Photoshop calls luminosity, which is really the brightness of the image. There are times where you may think that you're seeing clipping of tone, when in fact you're really seeing individual color clips, or all three color clippings, and the luminosity gives you a different feedback. We'll look at that in a second. The luminosity histogram is calculated very similarly to how Photoshop converts color images to grayscale. So what you're seeing down below is up at the top, I have the histogram of this particular image set for luminosity. And if I convert the image to grayscale using the standard image mode grayscale conversion, you see the histogram down below looks almost identical. So back in Photoshop, I just want to quickly show you the difference between viewing the histogram in RGB versus luminosity. And I've got a layer selected, which is the little dog in the upper left. And here we are, we're viewing the image in RGB, the composite. And if we zoom in, you can see it appears that we're really close to clipping highlights over on the far right. If I select luminosity and refresh, you can see that we get a different result. And that's simply because the luminosity histogram is based on our perception of brightness. And it just gives us a different way of looking at the image data. So you've seen that selections on images provide a histogram feedback. Even if you don't have layers, you can make a selection move around the image and the histogram will update. Histograms can be shown per layer. We can drag within a histogram to update the feedback with the stats. Basically, what you want to do is make sure that you have show statistics on if you want that particular feedback seen. And let's look at the difference between looking at an RGB composite histogram, a luminosity histogram, which we've seen, and then the individual color histograms as well. If we go back into Photoshop, we have our RGB histogram, which is all three composites. We can also look at just the red, the green, and the blue. The other option is to go down to colors, which gives us an overlay of all three, which is also very useful. You can toggle and say show all channels individually as well. Once again, as we move our cursor over the histogram, we get some feedback down below, should that be of interest to you. Okay, I want to go over the histogram feedback in colors and what they represent. It's a little geeky, but it's important because once you understand what those colors represent, it'll really help you in terms of understanding the histogram and clipping. So I've made a very, very simple document here. I have a foreground color, which is red 250. So it's not completely set to the maximum red. And what you can see down below is that I have my cursor over that red line, and it tells me that I'm at 250 red, 0 green, 0 blue. This color is against a white background, and you can see at the far right of the histogram there's a very large line at the very end that represents that white. I've got the channel set for color. So as you can see, I've got red 250, 0 green, 0 blue, but over on the far left, I've got a cyan line. Why? Well, because I have the histogram set for color. And what we're seeing here is basically that 0 green, 0 blue is 0 cyan. And so when you have the histogram set for color, Photoshop is showing us that line at the very, very end of the histogram on the very far left. With the cursor over the red line, it's interesting to note that the count is 110880. We'll keep that in mind. The reason we're seeing that is because it's representing only one channel, the color channel of red. If I move the cursor over to the far left for the cyan channel, you'll see that it shows me that it is at level 0. And the count is double the count above because I'm looking at two channels. I'm looking at the 0 green, 0 blue channel, and so the count is double the count that we saw on the far right. Now what I've done in Photoshop is I've just inverted the image. I did a Command I. So now cyan is at level 255 and red is now at level 5. If you look at the histogram, you can see once again a black line at the far left because our white background now became black or 0. You can also see the opposite effect. On the far left, we now have our red level at 5, which is green 255, blue 255. And on the far right, we can also see a cyan spike, which shows us at level 255. If we move the cursor over the cyan level, it now shows us it's at level 255. And once again, like we saw on the left, the count level is using two channels, so it's twice the number that we would have if we were just looking at one level. So it kind of gives you an idea of what count is doing. It's looking at the two color channels. What I've done here is I've made a gradient running from red 255, 0 green, 0 blue, so it's pure red, to red 128, green 128, blue 128, which is a neutral gray. And what I want to show you is how the histogram appears based on that information. So first of all, if I set the channel to just red, the histogram simply shows me that color channel, which is of course 128 to 255, and the histogram is showing us all of that information over on the far right. If I set the channel to colors, it shows me red on the right and cyan on the left, which makes sense after we saw that last slide. And lastly, if I set it to luminosity, I'm seeing a vastly different histogram because this is based on the brightness of the image, not those particular saturated colors. So it is in this example where you can see that the luminosity histogram gives us a completely different feedback than the either red, green, blue, or color histogram. The take home here is that RGB tells us about clipping and saturation. Luminosity tells us how close to black and white the image actually appears based on perception of brightness. So let's look at the histogram colors one more time, just so we're on the same page, and also how the show all color histogram is affected by this. I have the channel set to colors, and I have a gradient running from pure red to middle gray. I also have pure green to middle gray and pure blue to middle gray. And as you can see, the histogram above shows us the red on the right, the cyan on the left. And notice that the individual channels show us the same information, the red all pushed over to the right. But because we are looking at cyan, it is a component of green and blue. So when you see a cyan representation in histogram, what it's really telling you is information about the green and blue channels, as you can see in this illustration. Notice if I look at the green gradient, what we see in the three color channels below the main histogram is red and blue. So if a histogram shows you a magenta representation, what it's really talking about is the red channel and the blue channel. And lastly, I've got the blue gradient selected. It's hidden, unfortunately, but as you can see, we see yellow up above, and we see yellow because red and green create yellow. So now, if we go into the histogram that is represented in Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom, or if we look at the histogram in Photoshop showing all colors, you can now get an idea of what those particular colors are showing you. And what you can see is, if you see a green area in the histogram, it represents obviously the green channel. If you see blue, it represents the blue channel. If you see red, it represents the red channel. If you see yellow, what you're actually looking at is the red and green channel. If you see magenta, you're actually looking at the combination of red and blue. And if you see cyan, you're looking at the combination of green and blue. So this is useful when we talk about color clipping. In Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom, we can view saturation clipping when we select an RGB working space, and that's very, very useful in terms of what a histogram shows us. So for example, what you're seeing in this illustration is an image in Adobe Camera Raw, and I've got down below the encoding workspace set for sRGB. And you can see in the upper right histogram, at the far right, there is a very large red spike. And on the left, there is a very large blue spike, which means those two channels are clipping. And yet, if I go ahead and change that to Pro Photo RGB down below, you see that the saturation clipping is completely removed. What this tells us is that we can use a histogram within a raw converter to give us some idea whether or not that particular image will clip in one color space or the other. Now, I generally recommend that you always set your raw converter to Pro Photo RGB. But this illustrates why, if we use such a large color space, we can avoid saturation clipping. Now, histogram can be useful when you're editing your images, and I'm going to show you how we can do that in the Levels command. The Levels command can be used to compress or expand the tones. If we move the black slider to the right, it's going to set all the tones to the left of that slider to black, but what we're really doing is expanding all that data, and I'll show you that in a second. We can also set the histogram in Photoshop to different modes while we're actually working with the various tools such as Levels, and I'll show you that as well. Here we are in Adobe Photoshop, and we're going to look at this particular image. And as some will illustrate in other tutorials, what you can see is that there is no actual black in this area of the image. It's very flat, and one could say the same about white. Notice that I have this set for RGB, and I am over a particular layer. So if I go into Levels, we see a representation of the histogram, and of course they match. Notice I can actually click on the histogram while this dialog box is up. I can toggle so I can actually look at luminosity while I'm viewing the histogram. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move this slider all the way over to the left, move this over to the right a little bit. And one of the best ways of adjusting tones is to hold down the Alt or Option key and click on one of these sliders. And I think this is actually even a better way of deciding where you want to clip colors and tone. What you can see here is as I move the slider back and forth, it shows me what colors in the channels are clipping. And what you can see below is a magenta and some red and so on and so forth. And you can now understand that those are two channels that are clipping versus just one color channel. We see a little bit of the red clipping. That means just the red channel is clipping. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go OK and update the histogram. And if we go before and after, you can see what I've done is I've really changed the image by sliding everything over, at least on that far left side, over to the right to change those values. But what's actually happening? So here's my before image, and you can see at level 0 there are no tones assigned. And what I basically did is I just moved that black slider over to level 20. And notice the before and after histogram while that dialog box is open. It's quite useful. It appears that what I did is I moved everything from the left over to the right. But what I really did by moving the slider from 0 to 20 is I expanded that data. I took the data and stretched it over to the left side. Consequently, if I were to move the white slider from the right to the left, I'd be compressing that part of the tonal range, or compressing the data. We can compress data also by using the output sliders below. Here's the final histogram after I moved everything over from the left to the right, in other words, from 0 to level 20. And the result you can see in the histogram is a little bit of data loss. Think of this data like a rubber band. If I stretch the rubber band larger than it normally is, I'm stretching everything out. It's only 8 bits per color, and so I'm stretching everything out in order to reassign those tones, and the result is some data loss. Let's look at this in more detail and see how the histogram can show us data loss. Here I have a camera JPEG, and you can see the histogram below. And the histogram looks just fine. It's completely smooth, full of data, and yet the image itself looks a little down and muddy. So what I did in Photoshop is I went into my Levels command, and I moved my sliders a bit so that the image is now more open. And as you can see, the result is this combing or data loss. Each one of those white lines would normally represent one level within the particular image, 256 particular values. After adjusting this image, all the areas that do not have a white line are the result of data loss. Again, I've stretched that data apart. I didn't have that much to work with. And this illustrates why working with high bit data, more than 8 bits per color, is preferable. Now here's something that's rather interesting. Rather than edit the image in Photoshop, I took the JPEG into Lightroom. I actually think that the Lightroom edit looks a little bit better than the Photoshop edit. But what's really interesting is that you can see the resulting histogram from that image in Lightroom is very clean. There is no evidence of data loss. The take-home here is that if you are getting images from outside providers, one of the first things you might want to do is look at the histogram. If it looks like the histogram in the middle, you know somebody has severely edited the image and there's a lot of data loss. So that's where a histogram can be a diagnostic tool. Further, if you do have to edit the image, you might want to consider doing it in something like Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw. As you can see, the resulting edit produces a much better looking histogram in terms of data. So histograms and images. Some would suggest that looking at a histogram tells you whether or not an image is preferable or looks good. I would submit that's not necessarily the case. Let's play a game called Let's Look at the Histogram and then Let's Look at the Image. So here's a histogram, and as you can see, everything is all pushed over to the right. There's absolutely nothing from the midtones left to the blacks. There's got to be something wrong with this image, right? Well, no, it's just a very high-key image, white on white. There's no black in this image, or very little. It's a high-key image. Now here's what looks to be the opposite of that first image. Everything's shoved over to the left. Plus there's this huge clip of white on the far right. This is obviously an image that was improperly exposed or handled. What's going on here? Well, it's a very, very dramatic, low-key image with some highlights in the background from the lights of Times Square. It's rather moody, and that's the way I intended it to look. I'm hand-holding the camera outside in the middle of the night. One of the things that I did on purpose was to squash the blacks, to clip the blacks, in order to remove some of the noise in the image. We can look at the overlay that was shown to us in Lightroom. In Lightroom, I turned on the overlay, and all the areas that are solid blue, everything clipped to black. Areas that are showing red are clipped to white. And in this particular case, there really isn't anything in the image that's blocked up to black that's useful in terms of conveying what I wanted to express in this particular image. The take-home here is that you, as the image creator, should not be working necessarily by a histogram alone. If you want to block up a lot of shadow detail because there's nothing interesting there, and further, it might be filled with noise, by all means, go right ahead and do so. Here's another kind of strange-looking histogram. A lot of the data is all pushed over to the right and middle of midtones. There's no blacks anywhere within the image. Obviously, there's got to be something wrong with this particular shot. But again, we've got somewhat of a high-key type image. We have this very white bird against a blue sky. Moving on, let's talk about histograms that lie. First of all, we noticed that the histogram shows us one line per level. In other words, 256 of them. But if you're working in a 16-bit file, there should have been something like 64,000 of those lines in the histogram. Well, that would work if you had a display the size of a movie screen. Photoshop, Lightroom, and Camera Raw don't show you the true 16-bit data in the histogram, and that's because it would be very, very difficult to do so. It just shows you 256 levels. The other big lie are the histograms on the back of your camera. It's important to realize that when you look at the histogram on your camera, you're looking at the histogram of what the JPEG would be if you had set the camera to give you that particular data. If you're capturing raw data, it's just a big fat lie. We'll look at this again in more detail. The RGB histogram may not show tonal clipping, so you might want to use luminosity if possible. As you'll see, even the camera histograms can be wrong, even if they show you a luminosity histogram. Another lie, so to speak, is in Lightroom's histogram. It's showing you the histogram outside of soft proofing called Melissa RGB. And it isn't based on the actual processing color space that Lightroom is using. So here we're seeing the three different histograms in Lightroom. To the far left is what you'd normally see outside of softproof, which is Melissa RGB. Even the softproof mode I selected to Adobe RGB, or consequently an output profile, in this case an Epson, you can see that the histograms are not matching, that they're all somewhat different. So just to further illustrate the clipping overlays in Lightroom as an example, here's the image we were looking at previously that had a lot of black clipping. And if I hover over this triangle in the upper left, you can see all the pixels that clip to black, all the pixels that clip to white. And as I mentioned, one of the best ways of setting this, as you can see here, I'm using an older image that doesn't have process version 2012, but nonetheless, if I hold down the Alt-Option key and click on the black slider, I can see exactly where I want to clip black. And I think this works much better than using a histogram. In other words, looking at the image and seeing where on the image something is going to clip. And again, you can see that there are various colors here, giving us an idea of what channels are clipping. We get a much better idea of what we need to do to set that particular clipping. We can do it with exposure. In this case here, we can see the highlights and so on. What I want to show here is how the histogram on your camera can lie. And what you're seeing is several examples coming up whereby I've set the camera actually to expose plus a third of a stop. You can see that even the luminosity histogram shows me that there's clipping in the highlights. And yet, when I bring it into Lightroom, the histogram shows me that I have plenty of room. I'm not really clipping the highlights. And so this is another big fat lie that you're seeing on the back of your camera if you're shooting RAW. Yet another example where we're seeing the luminosity histogram showing severe clipping, as seen in the far right. And that's because it's based on the JPEG that the camera will produce, not necessarily the raw data. Here I brought the image into Lightroom once again. You can see all the sliders are set to 0, and yet there is no clipping. Again, one more example. Here we see a large white spike on the far right histogram on the back of the camera, even though I've set the camera to shoot at plus a third. Once I bring it into Lightroom, even before I even manipulate it, there's no clipping being seen here. So this is an example where if you're shooting raw data on your camera, you pretty much need to disregard the histogram. It's a big fat lie. It doesn't tell you anything about the raw data. Which brings us to histograms and exposed to the right, or ETTR. And the idea between exposed to the right is to ignore, or let's say compensate, the histogram on the back of the camera, because as you've seen in those last 3 slides, it's just completely wrong. So the idea is not to overexpose the image. The idea is to expose properly for raw data. The more you underexpose raw data, the more noise you're going to introduce into the image. And exposed to the right is simply the idea, look at the camera histogram and expose to the right of that camera histogram. Or what I would say is figure out what your camera is capable of shooting, and then based on the raw data, set exposure compensation or manual exposure such that you are getting the ultimate or ideal exposure for the raw data. Exposed to the right isn't about overexposing. It's about exposing for the highlights you wish to record. Expect the initial rendering in a raw converter to appear too light, but by normalizing the tone, the highlight data you properly expose can be seen. So here's an example of what I mean by normalization. The image above is the exposed to the right exposure. And yes, when you initially bring it into Lightroom or Camera Raw, in this particular case, it does appear overexposed, and the histogram does indicate that it is, quote, overexposed, unquote. But I have plenty of information in this raw file. All I have to do is simply move the exposure down to minus 1.15 in this particular case, and what appeared to be overexposed, blown out highlights isn't really the result. There is plenty of tonal information the raw data captured. So normalization is simply the idea of altering the controls within the raw converter to produce a good histogram. And in this particular case, I didn't blow out any highlights that I wish to retain. The initial rendering looks, quote, overexposed, but it really isn't. And the net result is much better image data. With the Adobe RAW converters, I've noticed that the exposure slider correlates pretty well with how much I've overexposed or exposed to the right the image based on what the histogram on the camera or my light meter in the camera told me. So in this case, all I have to do is move the slider down about 1.15 for this particular image, and all of the data is really there. Again, here is the histogram on the back of the camera. Based on the image above. It shows that I've overexposed and blown out all the information, but what I really did was I exposed to the right. I deliberately exposed more than what that lying histogram told me was the facts of the matter, and once I bring it into Lightroom and normalize the image, it doesn't appear overexposed. A few tips. If you want a quick luminosity histogram in Lightroom and Camera Raw, that option, unlike Photoshop, is not available. So what you can do is simply click on the Convert to Grayscale conversion, and that'll give you a pretty good idea of what the luminosity histogram should look like. It's not going to be exactly the same as Photoshop's because the processing path and data is different. Since we don't really have a luminosity histogram in Camera Raw or Lightroom, you can toggle back and forth very quickly and get an idea of what you would be getting if you had such a histogram. As I said, to see clipping in tone and color, the Alt-Option key on a number of sliders in Camera Raw and Lightroom are the way to go. Rather than depend on the histogram itself, by holding down the Alt-Option key on the various sliders, you can see specifically what is clipping and where on the image. That's really so much more useful than just looking at the histogram. Here's another neat trick that you might want to look at in terms of histograms in Lightroom. If I hover over the histogram, I can actually click and drag and manipulate the tonal range based on where I place my cursor. And you can see down below that the corresponding controls will also update. I can also hold down the Alt and Option key and see the clipping as I move these particular sliders. A few final thoughts. Histograms are useful, but you need to know when and where to look at the data and take that data to the bank. It's really good for clipping, both saturation and tone. It's also very useful to look at data loss. Now, if you're working in high-bit files, 16-bit per color, you're not going to see that particular data loss. Or if people are providing you files in 8 bits per color, looking at the histogram can tell you whether the image has been severely edited and there's data loss. Histograms lie, so understand when they tell you what's useful information and when they're telling you a big fat lie. And again, simply looking at a histogram doesn't tell you much about the image content or quality or rendering. There are many times where you may want to clip data in the shadows or in the highlights. That's entirely up to you. That's about all I have for today. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to email me, and I hope that this tutorial was of use. Thank you.